And welcome also people joining us online. Hopefully it's drier with you than it is here in Belfast this afternoon. It's a great pleasure for us to have back today Dr. Connal Parr. Connal was with us 10 days ago when we had a one-day conference on Labour history in West Belfast. He was talking about Paddy Devlin and Labour politics, the post-war years. Today he's here to talk to us about another subject, one which he's doing a lot of groundbreaking research on of late. Connal is Assistant Professor of History and the Programme Leader for History and Politics at Northumbria University in Newcastle. His first book was Inventing the Myth, Political Passions and the Ulster Protestant Imagination in 2017. And his current research is building on his expertise in Northern Ireland to comparatively explore how states such as South Africa, Spain, Chile, and others with a divided and violent past have coped with the legacies of those pasts, and at how specifically how arts and culture resonate with the transitional justice element, playing an active role in conflict transformation and peace building across the world. His second book, which was published towards the end of last year by Oxford University Press, is Solidarity and Pressure, the Story of the Irish Anti-Apartheid Movement. And that's what he's going to be talking to us about today. No Borders, the Irish Anti-Apartheid Movement and its Legacies. Connal, you're very welcome.
Thank you very much indeed, Peter, and really nice to be back with your faces. And good to be back always at the Institute. I want to talk today about how the Irish Anti-Apartheid Movement, which was founded in Dublin in April 1964, operated in Northern Ireland, and also its legacies, how it reaches beyond its lifetime. There were a number of myths about the Irish Anti-Apartheid Movement hereafter, the IAAM, that it told about itself, and to others. The first I'm going to start with, as I think it allows me to set up other aspects of the movement in a social and political sense, is that it was a single issue organization committed only to opposing apartheid in South Africa. And it was sketched very plainly to me by a man named Rafik Motia, who is an Indian South African who arrived in Ireland from Johannesburg in 1965, a year after the IAAM was founded, who was by profession an economist with the central bank, but he would go on to play a major role on the IAAM executive committee. And what Mortier said was, we built up a massive coalition right across the board. Our focus eventually was South Africa. Our focus essentially was South Africa. We tried not to get too involved in local politics. We always said, all we want for you is to support us, to put pressure on the Irish government, to put pressure on South Africa. So we avoided all the other kinds of things that many organizations get caught in. You could be a Trotskyist, a communist, a priest, a trade unionist, a businessman. We had them all, Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael, Labour, Sinn Féin. The issue for us was we had built a coalition where our main objective was to influence politics against South Africa. And this is the genius of Kader Asmal, that he managed to keep it as broad-based as possible and tried to get support from every section of Irish society. Now, in terms of the point about building coalitions, this is absolutely true. And one of the most successful tactics of the movement, which I go into detail on in my book on the movement, retailing at a cool 100 quid, very definite value for money. And a lot of this, as Motier also said correctly, was down to Kader Asmal. However, I show by dint of Kader Asmal's involvements and those of many members of the executive committee, the movement overlapped with the issues of civil rights in Northern Ireland, as well as issues around civil liberties, Irish nationalism, other Southern African liberation movements, and the European Economic Community. We should indeed always begin with any focus on the IAAM with looking at its person of origin, Asmal, who was stationed at Trinity College Dublin for almost 3 decades. Later, he was recognisable to many as a minister in the new South African governments of Nelson Mandela and Thabo Mbeki. Whatever your take on him, and there are negative as well as positive views about him in Ireland, he is the enigmatic critical figure of the movement because of his energy, his activism, his reach in Ireland as a human rights lawyer, and through his recognisability as it was then in Irish life. He'd be on television, he'd be on platforms and in the public eye. And while it's a bit of an exaggeration to say, as one member of the EC put it to me, that he introduced race to Ireland, he was conspicuous at a time when it's rare for people of colour to be in Ireland. He's a flamboyant and big character. People more Irish than the Irish, one of my interviewees said to me, lover of seafood, paddy whiskey and cigarettes, 100 a day. You heard that correct. Everyone in Dublin seems to have a Kader Asmal story. One ANC colleague later observed that Asmal registered with a certain Irish national personality, if such a thing can be said to exist. The sharp humour, ebullience, and oral culture. So when he joked about being the only Indian South African Irishman in the world, he wasn't just speaking about citizenship. He was speaking about a world, a mode of experience, a mode of being. If Asmal came to inform Ireland about race, then Ireland also shaped him. He's born in KwaZulu-Natal in October 1934 to parents from the Indian community established in Natal as a workforce for sugar plantations in the 19th century. As one of 8 children of a Muslim shopkeeper, he later joked that his upbringing was typical of an Irish family, and he claimed that his father presented him with a shilling copy of James Connolly's Labour in Irish History when he was about 12 years old. And even if this is Asmal telling his Irish interviewer what she wanted to hear, there's no doubt that he inherited his dad's deep anti-colonialism and national liberation movement drive across Africa. Asmal was a sickly, vulnerable child who took refuge in learning and school. Crucially, he also comes of age during the post-war liberal moment. The broader values of the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the First Geneva Convention mould his outlook. He secured an external primary degree from the University of South Africa in 1957 and decided after a stint as a school teacher, the best way to challenge apartheid was through a career in law. So in December 1958, he leaves from the very mixed race area of District 6 and is completely wiped off the map by the time he returns to South Africa in the early 1990s and travels to London, where he completes his studies at the London School of Economics and co-founding the British anti-apartheid movement in his spare time. He eventually qualified as a barrister at Lincoln's Inn and turned down a job at the University of Ghana following an interview chaired by one Conor Cruz O'Brien, and moved instead to Ireland in 1963 to take up a junior lectureship specialising in human rights, labour and international law at Trinity. The specialisms reflect Kader Asmal's underlying progressive politics, even if he's very careful to make sure this radical clue doesn't dominate the associations of the IAAM. So it's important to place Asmal as one of the exiles who fled South Africa due to government attention. London was an especially significant outpost for this diaspora, with names such as Albie Sachs, Ruth First, and Joe Slovo, all spending years there or passing through. Indian South Africans, names such as Villa Pile and Abdul Minty were another London cohort. The ANC's top man in London is always Oliver Tambo on the left there, and it's Tambo who tells Ireland to be the ANC's man who tells Asmal to be the ANC's man in Ireland. Lest it be forgotten, the work of the exiles was grueling and often dangerous. Ruth First, on the right here, some people know was assassinated by South African agents in Mozambique in 1982, while Albie Sachs lost his right eye and his right arm in a similar attack 6 years later. And by the time Tambo returned to South Africa after his exile, in 1990, his health is blitzed by extensive travel, stress, overwork, and he suffered a stroke and died 3 years later before Nelson Mandela was elected president of South Africa. Even at this stage, Asmal was developing ideas that law can and should correct structural inequalities and injustices, a theme he would pursue throughout his time in Ireland and beyond. And many people will be aware of the pivot of the Sharpeville massacre in March 1960, when the police shot dead 91 Black South Africans who were protesting against the past laws. From his time in London onwards, Asmal began working officially with the ANC and concurrently joined the underground South African Communist Party, where details of his membership remain very hazy. Asmal's industry with the British movement was noticed in London, and he met Louise Parkinson, who was an activist in her own right, member of the National Council for Civil Liberties, and they married at the end of December 1961. And one of the things, when you look at the Irish Anti-Apartheid Movement, I found was that often Kader Asmal overshadows Louise, and actually she's incredibly important She's the organizational rock. She writes a lot of the speeches, does a lot of the grind, the day-to-day organization, fundraisers, runs the International Defence and Aid campaign, lots of things on the boil. The couple settled down to raise their two sons, Rafiq and Adam, who are Irish. You know, I met Adam Asmal, and I said, you know, you sure you were looking forward to going home? And he said, I'm not going home. I'm Irish. I grew up in Ireland, and this change in identity comes a little bit later. And the Asmals run the Irish Anti-Apartheid Movement from their homes in Terenure, Dundrum, and finally Fox Rock. So again, it's kind of hard to underestimate how exotic people found Kader Asmal in Ireland in the 1960s onwards. One of the leaders of the Duns Stores protest later observed that the first time the strikers had laid eyes on a black man was at their 1984 picket, a guy called Nimrod Sajake and several others. Even then, the only black people living here were either the families of diplomats and ambassadors, or a very lucky privileged few who could afford to travel here and study at Trinity or University College Dublin. Students, merchant seamen also made up these numbers, but it's rare that at this time that Irish people, even in 1984 and mid-1980s, would encounter a coloured face. And this isn't without its consequences. Despite simplistic claims to the contrary, I always find a bit of a complacency over the issue in Ireland. Racism is not absent from Irish life. In the summer of 1964, which was a matter of months after the Irish movement was founded, there were a spate of attacks on Nigerians and other African students in Dublin, which were reported. When the Asmals first arrived in Ireland, they found it difficulty to secure accommodation because they were a mixed couple. I unearthed that their home was attacked on at least one occasion with some kind of incendiary device hurled at their door. Somebody told me about. And Louise received racist letters objecting to her mixed marriage, which are held in the Irish Anti-Apartheid Movement's records in the National Library in Ireland in Kildare Street. Similarly, despite the anti-apartheid networks that sprung up in the UK and Ireland, the 1960s actually saw the strengthening of apartheid. It's the Cold War. And the 1950 Group Areas Act was reconstituted to further residential classification for different racial groups. Then, famously, the ANC leadership, including Mandela, was taken out by South African agents and imprisoned at the Rivonia trial of 1963 to 1964. This was a particularly low ebb of the anti-apartheid movement, and nowadays everyone, including British Conservative Party politicians who actively backed the apartheid regime and denounced Mandela as a terrorist, proclaim their support for him in recent times, and the statues go up in Parliament Square. But back in 1964, the ANC was on its knees, and we have to remember the Cold War context the exiles are operating in. The United States, the United Kingdom, and several key members of the European Economic Community were essentially pro-apartheid. So I think it's important to remember the pushback that people face within the movement. It is, however, operating in safer waters in Ireland. Rafiq Motiar, again, the Honorary Secretary, notes the proximity of 1960s Ireland to the revolutionary generation of 1916 to 1923, which enables the group to make inroads in the population. Ireland in the 1960s is only a few generations away from 1916, Motiar said, so there was a natural anti-colonial atmosphere in the 60s. Ireland could identify much closer to liberation movements elsewhere. They could understand the exploitation. They could understand, for us at that time, there was a very strong vein we could tap into. And they have various platforms. They try and get every party represented of the three main parties at the time, Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael and Labour, on that platform. And there's a platform where they get Lieutenant General Sean McKeown, a Longford hero from the War of Independence, to talk about his opposition to apartheid. And again, the revolutionary generation had a good relationship with the Boers, with the white South Africans. So there was an interesting dynamic at play. It's also fair to say there's no serious pro-apartheid lobby in Ireland, with the exception of the Irish Rugby Football Union. I'm not going to be on their Christmas cards list, despite being a big Ireland fan. But they consistently ran tours and send players, referees and personnel to South Africa right up until 1989. And they're very unashamed about it. Pro-apartheid sentiment also appears on record from individuals writing personally to Irish Anti-Apartheid Movement members, and even in the Irish Times letter page. Their early brochures emphasised the very important Irish instrument of the boycott. especially fruit, which made up by far the largest of Irish imports to Ireland. But in general terms, the IAAM sought to educate people in Ireland in the revolutionary facts, the basic display of information. And the strength of the Irish movement lies in its cross-party support, which differentiates it, for instance, from the United Kingdom, where it's associated with one party, the Labour Party. And in America, likewise, they'll be more associated with the Democrat Party to a degree. I'll talk a bit more about that later. But that cross-party bipartisanship is quite a unique achievement of the Irish movement, and it separates it from some others. Popular interest could be very high. Dublin lectures can easily draw 500 to 800 attendees. And when Oliver Tambo comes to Dublin with some Irish speakers, including Owen Dudley Edwards, to discuss racialism on South African Freedom Day, 26th of June, 1968, 900 people were there. There was one meeting at University College Cork where 1,000 people showed up. Key branches appeared in Cork City, several universities, including later Queen's, and especially East Cork, where while individual donations arrived from all counties of Ireland, taxi drivers, nuns, riders, trade unionists. Its membership hummed along at around 2,000 members for most of the organisation's history, and it operates as a pressurising force. In any instance, South Africa appears to be enjoying a normalising success. The Irish Anti-Apartheid Movement steps into the fray to apply pressure to politicians or people of note in Ireland. And so I think it's interesting to consider with the movement that it's a lobbying group, and it's a bit of a pioneering lobbying group for other solidarity organisations, including the modern pro-Palestinian lobby, a model for how people and public opinion can be mobilised. I'm going to turn now to the movement in Northern Ireland. One of the leading members of the executive committee used a particular phrase with me: "We never recognised the border," he said. During the mid-1960s, there was simply one Northern Ireland branch based in Belfast. Cross-border communications were initially quite limited, and the perception in Dublin, at least, was that Northern Ireland was, quote, so far away it is difficult to get them interested. Nevertheless, the Irish Anti-Apartheid Movement always encouraged the Belfast branch, and the first one was driven by its secretary, Mary Jackson, and accompanied by half a dozen sponsors, including Northern Trade Union figures, church figures, and nationalist politicians. The local authorities in the Royal Ulster Constabulary monitored one of the branch's first gatherings at the non-subscribing Presbyterian Hall in Rosemary Street in the centre of the city due to the presence of Communist Party members in the ring. This Northern Ireland branch fudged the question of whether to be a Northern Irish or an Irish branch body, wanting to keep close contact with both Dublin and London. It didn't have a hugely active programme. It brought over the activist and writer Hilda Bernstein to speak in Belfast, and there was folk concerts and several demonstrations. But the pressure of rising communal tensions, anticipating the oncoming conflict, hampered its development. The people in the north of Ireland appear to be too engrossed in their own troubles, apartheid of another sort, religious, Jackson wrote to a colleague in England. The branch became dormant, with some of the members moving south to continue their activities in other ways at the end of the 1960s. Later, the Dunstore strike seemed to lead to a proliferation of branches. So while some fade away, Belfast, Derry and Omagh, the last increasingly vocal in the 1980s, were notably active north of the border. Occasionally, branches such as Newry proposed innovative ideas to attract new membership from marginalised groups, including the unemployed. As I mentioned earlier, Asmal's associations with civil rights and Irish nationalism were an important part of his profile. He had links with the Connolly Association and the civil rights movement, as well as with the Wolfe Tone Society. Asmal was a member of that and gave lectures to both it and the IRA in the 1960s. These engagements often presented challenges. At one meeting of the latter, a volunteer was heard to say when he saw Asmal, "I see you have coons involved here." Letters appeared in the United Irishman, Sinn Féin's newspaper, defending both apartheid and, amazingly, Portuguese colonialism in southern Africa. Asmal brushed off such attitudes to speak at about Easter 1916 and 20th century international liberation movements at the Wolfe Tone Society's 1916 lecture series in Jury's Hotel in May 1966. 6 months later, he appeared at a seminar organised by the group in Belfast at the War Memorial Building. His lecture focused on civil rights violations and the European Convention on Human Rights. And this was followed by a second meeting on the 29th of January 1967, which was the gathering that brought the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association into being at the International Hotel in Belfast. Asmal is there and talking. He continues lecturing to the Wolfe Society throughout the late 60s and 70s. At a meeting of the Dublin Regional Council of the Labour Party in the Mansion House in August 1970, attended by 300 people, he chaired Eamon McCann and Connal Parr O'Brien, again discussing the overhaul of law enforcement system in Northern Ireland. The meeting called for the release of Bernadette Devlin, who had been arrested in June of that year, with Asmal paying tribute to her as a young person driving change in familiar Irish lineage. 3 years later, he was consulted by the Social Democratic and Labour Party when its MPs seeking advice were invited to be part of a Standing Orders Committee of the Northern Ireland Assembly, and he helped draft the party's constitution. Some familiar faces to people here, I imagine. Finally, in 1979, an official and long-mooted Belfast branch did appear with its dominant profile, the Reverend Norman W. Taggart. Taggart was a liberal Methodist minister interested by South Africa, and he quickly became the Belfast branch chair. Another significant presence was Avila Kilmurray on the right, who went on to a long career in peace building and trade unionism in Derry and Belfast, having initially been involved in the Dublin Irish Anti-Apartheid Movement at the age of 14. She wrote letters for the Dublin branch at the same time as studying history and politics at UCD, and she then took a master's in Australia, came back to Ireland and got involved in northern politics and community work. In 1980, she came to live in Belfast and became involved in anti-apartheid activities again, this time as the Belfast branch's secretary. Other members included trade unionists such as the late Joe Law from the Protestant working class Hammer area, and Brenda Callaghan from the Catholic working class Falls, who came into the movement in the 80s, and they met at an Irish Anti-Apartheid Movement event and married a few years later. There's a clear enjoyable social dimension to the branch's activities. So they have collections in places like Musgrave Park in the south of the city. Trade unionists do this night collection. It's really late. It goes on to 4 a.m. or something. And then one of them worked at Musgrave Park Hospital and brought them over and cooked breakfast for them afterwards. They organized direct action of their own, including pickets of Shell stations. And they're very independent of Dublin. And it's a theme that kind of comes through, which is the control of the movement in Dublin is very straitjacket. And Kader Asmal brings a lot of his ANC and Communist Party associations into how he controls the movement. And it avoids a split and it keeps it together. But equally, it's very dismissive of dissenting, especially far left, ultra left voices. And I found quite a lot of that. Roughly 10 people attended Belfast branch meetings in various different venues. There's the Belfast Unemployed Resources Centre is a popular haunt, and the Governor Hall Centre before that. Belfast was also the scene of the first Irish Anti-Apartheid Movement AGM outside Dublin, which was, again, just beside the Rosemary Presbyterian Church, and the delegates went to the Duke of York pub after. The Irish Anti-Apartheid Movement was always aware the Northern conflict was liable to, quote, cast a grim shadow over our plans and actions, as it admitted at the end of 1972, the deadliest year of the Troubles. Kilmurray's perspective as someone who worked in both Dublin and Belfast offers a bit of useful comparative insight. There was a virulence in opposition to the anti-apartheid movement in Belfast that you didn't get in Dublin. I mean, it came from, to be quite honest, that loyalist connection, pro-Israeli, pro-white South African, a much more antagonistic reaction from the cops, stuff like that, at any of those protests. In the South, what you got was, we don't understand really what's going on, and we're not really interested, but there was an alignment here that was much harder, she said. While there was also a hardness in Ireland, I have to agree that Northern Ireland did test the movement's dedication to cross-party aspirations. Just before an Ireland rugby tour to South Africa in 1981, it was pointed out at a public meeting attended by a couple of hundred people that just 3 public figures in Irish political life were in favour of the tour: the Reverend Ian Paisley, MEP, John Taylor, MEP, and William Ross, MP. All were unionist politicians, with Paisley's followers noted in particular for their zeal for apartheid, and Ian Smith's white minority Rhodesia regime, which was trumpeted in the Protestant Telegraph newspaper. Paisley's right-hand man, Major Ronald Bunting, had once declared he would seek a job in South Africa and that it would be a place to go to because it had, quote, the right ideas. At the same time, There's a few instances that suggest that unionists could be a bit more complicated about this, and it's good to muddy the narratives. Belfast anti-apartheid activists caught wind of some potential South African activity at the end of the 1980s when the ex-Learfan aviation factory in Belfast was taken over by an Iraqi company and a group called Space Research Corporation. The managing director, a guy called Gerald Bull, had links to illegal arms sales to South Africa. And after correspondence from the Irish Anti-Apartheid Movement and Belfast activists, the takeover was brought to the attention of the Northern Ireland office. And the surprising ally in the case to nip this murky activity in the bud was the Unionist MP for North Down, Jim Kilfedder, always a bit of a maverick, who turned out to be an interesting ally in the case. Equally, it's worth noting the engagements of the ANC's Tabika Mujolo in 1986 and 1987. Mujolo gave several talks in Belfast and Dublin. She had been involved in Trinity College's Dublin branch, and the one I have here is some people recognize the men in the picture, particularly at the Women's Centre in Donegal Street. The man just second from the left is, of course, Gusty Spence, who is an icon of the Ulster Volunteer Force, who've been associated with the first killings of the Troubles and reactivated the outfit in the mid-1960s. By 1986, when this photo was taken, Spence was a couple of years out of prison and quietly campaigning for the Progressive Unionist Party, trying to further its socialist programme. Loyalist links with apartheid were active in this time frame. I'm not going into these today, but I do in my book, making Spence's engagement here all the more noteworthy.
The women's the founder of the women's rights movement.
Yes, it is indeed, and I was going to mention Linda. So the event was chaired by Linda Walker, a veteran communist and Belfast Trades Council member, and you can see Spence and another loyalist called Ken Gibson on the far left there. Some people will recall as well, listening to her as she's speaking. And according to Walker, they were sympathetic to the ANC, which again goes against some of the images that people have about loyalists. A lasting Derry anti-apartheid branch never truly materialised, but as with other counties, certain profiles were prominent. John Hume had been denouncing visits of the Springboks rugby team to Northern Ireland in the Stormont Parliament since the mid-1960s. As a minister in the Sunningdale executive, he signed petitions with his party colleagues calling for Ireland to withdraw its players from the British Lions rugby tour of South Africa, and his consciousness of South Africa carried over to his subsequent long marches through the political establishments of the East Coast of the United States, London and Brussels. In the United States in particular, where he was close with Democratic Party politicians and Irish America as a counterweight to IRA fundraising, Hume tried to persuade American politicians of the need for economic sanctions against South Africa. One representative he engaged on the issue, and some people know what I'm going to say here, in the late 1970s and early 80s was one Senator Joe Biden of Delaware. Though Democratic politicians could be sympathetic to the anti-apartheid cause, most were diffident about sanctions. They would confirm their moral opposition to apartheid, but they would talk of reforms instead of apartheid's removal, and specifically did not want to make a material impact on it. So such politicians missed this inherent contradiction, and that led to John Hume's interventions. Hume publicly praised the ANC's policies and leadership at a time when many American politicians argued the organization was, again, a terrorist group and a bigger threat than apartheid itself. He knew the ANC's literature, he knew about the Freedom Charter, and he noted that Albert Luthuli had been an inspiration to Martin Luther King in the US civil rights movement. Some of us in Northern Ireland were inspired in turn by King, perhaps not realizing that our approach had much of its origin in South Africa. Above all, Hume used every opportunity to push for sanctions, which he said would strip away the economic fabric which protects apartheid. Interestingly, he called Pretoria the ball and chain of underdevelopment which ties the feet of the African continent, its strategic position such that it would devastate the economic engines of other African countries under the guise of being the Western world's enterprise zone. As MP for Foyle in the Westminster Parliament, Hume often found himself opposite pro-apartheid Conservative MPs, a party with strong connections to that regime. The 1986 Register of Members' Interest revealed that 71 Conservative MPs had links with South African companies, while close to half of funds sent to the Conservative Party in 1984 hailed from South African company investments. Similarly, pro-South African Unionist MPs surround Hume on the House of Commons green benches, and for this reason, he used his speeches in London to draw attention to Black perspectives, emphasising the need for sanctions, and which would allow the dialogue between Blacks and Whites that people talked about. He raised resolutions on behalf of other Irish MEPs in the European Parliament, and which he'd been elected to in 1979, and made a particular effort to back the Dunnes Stores strike in the mid-1980s. And you can see him in the slide with the woman in the centre there is Mary Manning, who was the original leader of the Dunnes Stores strike and who started the protest. He's also impressed by the role of students in the anti-apartheid movement, and he says they create more pressure than any other group. I don't have time to go into all Asmal's activities in Ireland, but I have to mention a few, as well as helping establish the Irish Federation of University Teachers, the IFUT union, which is still going. Asmal was on the side of some unfashionable causes, as his work with the Irish Council of Civil Liberties, which he co-founded in 1978, regularly placed him on. He was prominent in the campaign against Ireland joining the European Economic Community in 1973, and we need to locate this opposition to European membership in light of the practical economic support countries like Germany at the time had and gave to apartheid. Asmal also found time to be part of numerous inquiries, often pursued along international legal and humanitarian lines. He chaired an early shoot to kill inquiry, which the findings were published by Mercia Press there. But perhaps more notably, in 1982, Asmal joined Sean McBride in constituting an independent commission and an inquiry into the Israeli invasion of Lebanon. Several other academics were involved, with McBride chairing, and the commission was clear it had been set up to investigate concerns about reported violations of human rights and civil liberties, the classification and treatment of prisoners, and the contravention of existing international conventions. And it concluded that Israel was committed all these violations and should pay reparations to Lebanon and to international relief agencies. The inquiry was advertised in the English and American press and was published by the Journal of Palestine Studies, where it's still available. An early precursor to the current South African case against Israel at the International Court of Justice, the Commission also recommended that a competent international body be established to clarify the conception of genocide in relation to Israeli policies and practices towards the Palestinian people. So one of the things I argue in my book is that Asmal's career as a minister in the first governments of the new South Africa is itself a legacy of the Irish Anti-Apartheid Movement. As the travel writer Dervla Murphy joked, soon after his first ministerial appointment, Kader was Ireland's contribution to the new cabinet. It sounds like the boss agents from South Africa are very annoyed going over this. We have to back up at this point. By the end of apartheid, South African anti-apartheid activists were divided into three occasionally conflicting groups: the exiles, the prisoners, and the internal movement, which banded together in umbrella organizations like the United Democratic Front. Kader Asmal naturally was in the first camp. His academic papers in the 1980s, and he does a lot of them. Again, his sheer industry is quite interesting when you look on him as an academic. For those involved in program leadership and highly important matters like that, he's doing a heck of a lot. And they show a very clear set of principles around and planned objectives around constitutional issues, policing reform, Namibia, at the same time as sealing the illegitimacy and human rights record of apartheid. The same papers also began to discuss how the ANC could pursue a negotiated settlement with apartheid's clock ticking. And again, he's preparing for a new country, and that new country has to be built. And he expresses this design, as academics tend to, through papers, which we don't always think matter, but for someone like Kader Asmal, they do matter. And he's doing this from his desk in Dublin before the new South Africa is born. He's thinking about it in those papers. The law he practiced in human rights, constitutional matters, state succession, all the things he was teaching us about at Trinity, when you look back on it, one of his students remembered, it was all planning for the future of South Africa. At the same time, a bruising set of programs lay in store for those in the new government, South Africa's first under universal suffrage. Asmal likened South African reconstruction in the 1990s to Ireland in the 1920s, with vast water and forestry plans comparable to the electrification programme of Cumann na nGaedheal in 1927. It's very interesting when you talk to people talk about problems in South Africa in the 90s and in the present. Remember, South Africa is a young country. It's 30 years just old, basically. And if you look back at Ireland in the 1950s, when it's a similar age, it's also an economic basket case. So when people patronize South Africa and they say it's usually undermining it because certain groups are in charge, we have to remember those kind of facts. Along with Thabo and Mbeki, Cyril Ramaphosa, and above all Mandela, Asmal was viewed as one of the respectable faces of the ANC. Generally, it was felt that Mandela charmed the whites, while the rest of them joined him in charming investors and the markets. Regarded as a safe pair of hands, Asmal was minister for all portfolios, rated by Mandela, no less, and making an apparent success of any task sent his way. He was always more popular with Mandela than with the rest of the ANC. In May 1994, following the party's election success and Irish congratulations from Taoiseach Albert Reynolds and Taoiseach Dick Spring, he was appointed Minister of Water Affairs and Forestry, a critical post in furthering the ANC's reconstruction and development programme, designed to cater for around 7 million South Africans who are living in poverty, lacking formal housing, healthcare, employment and running water. And for his part, Asmal envisions water as a right, same as access to food and education. Initially driven by the Congress of South African Trade Unionists with policies committed to improving the lives of workers, the reconstruction programme was immediately under pressure from economists and the forces of international capital, whose aim was to preserve market fundamentals. Though he still found time for writing, Asmal wanted to correspond more with his old Irish friends and comrades. We need time and space to do the right things, but there does not seem to be any, as there are so many pressures, he wrote. The new president was also part of his routine, as Mandela's body was conditioned by Robben Island to rise very early. He would ring Asmal at 5 a.m. as the working start of the day and discuss cabinet business. Asmal nevertheless continued his drinking, whipping out whiskey bottles in interviews, though reducing his 100 cigarette a day intake. His tenure came to be viewed as one of the success stories of the new government. South Africa was a water-scarce country that faced crippling water shortages potentially. So listening to scientists and creating partnerships between government and academia, not dissimilar to his broad-based approach in Ireland, Asmal brought together experts and approached other ministers to develop projects to remove invasive species, drive job creation, so you would involve communities and create employment within water production. And the main resulting public works programme was something called Working for Water, which became a pioneering model in developing countries. Combined with the National Water Act of 1998, which set higher values for luxury use of water in swimming pools and so on, Asmal's first cabinet post was genuinely transformative. From 1994 until 1999, over 3 million South Africans gained access to clean water, and in 1998 to 1999, over 1,000 projects were initiated to provide a further 5 million access to 5 million people. By the end, 80% of the population received water, and half the population had access to present-day sanitation. Asmal took time out from his ministerial duties to help open the first embassy of South Africa in Ireland in Alexander House at Earl's Court Terrace, where it's actually the launch where I launched this book, which is nice. Accompanied by former comrades, old friends, asked him, now he was inside the government, if he'd seen any of the secret files and documentation from apartheid. Of course, I looked at the files, Asmal confirmed, claiming that after the British anti-apartheid movement, we were the biggest fucking thorn in their sides. There's a nice story that the Irish government provided a police escort to him, and so they sent a delegation of the guards, and they greet him at Dublin Airport and welcome him home. And one of them said to him, in the interest of full disclosure, this was the guard's language, that back in the early 1980s, he had been watching and besetting the Asmal household in Foxrock. Asmal laughed, appreciating the guard's language and seeing the trajectory of the story as something that can only really happen in Ireland. However, the revolutionaries were in government and had unpopular decisions to make to maintain budgets, emphasising foreign investment. Asmal agreed to privatise over 300,000 hectares of state-owned forest, raising 1.5 billion rand for the government. He referenced Ireland once again when he noted that Fianna Fáil won the 1977 Irish general election by a landslide, with policies including abolishing the rates on houses. Such measures won the election in the short term, but were built on borrowing, saddling the Irish state's economy with interest and overborrowing for decades. With payments still a legacy, successive Irish governments had to proceed cautiously, and this taught Asmal and the ANC not to make short-term decisions for popular electoral gain. In 1999, Asmal was diagnosed with bone marrow cancer, but his condition was not debilitating. Finally gave up smoking and continued in Mbekki's cabinet, shifting to education. This was another immensely difficult portfolio. Due to the structural damage caused by successive apartheid governments who spent 10 times more on white education than on blacks. A sticker on the door to his new office read, "If you think education is expensive, try ignorance." Though he said publicly it was the pinnacle of his career, Louise confided to an old Dublin friend that Kader and Asmal was shocked by the scale of the problems, where there are constant crises all over the place. Ireland naturally once again informed his vision that education was vital, that things could be turned around from a position of weakness. A quarter of a century after reforms in Irish upper secondary education, the famous measures introduced by Donogh O'Malley, Asmal informed one interviewer that Irish students were the most skilled and best educated kids in Europe. Such reforms were needed in South Africa too, though this was not a successful program. And this is the sort of downside of the story to his ministerial career. His reforming efforts in curriculum and secularization were frustrated at both grassroots and high political level. Later, Asmal took a particular interest in themes of truth and reconciliation in South Africa and the world over. His interest in the idea preceded his time in government, though it's possible to detect an Irish angle through his publications for obvious reasons, and he maintained that to conceal the past or attempt to forget the past will have tragic consequences. Asmal's argument was that by appearing in front of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, you were accepting that it's still an issue that's semantically fought over by scholars, but you acknowledge that apartheid was an inherent crime against humanity in your appearance in front of it. And that's the genesis of your actual presence there. The issue was the ANC would also have to face the glare too, especially for its conduct in the exiles camps. And any suggested comparison between anti-apartheid militants and the South African state faced resistance from within the ANC, including from Mbeki. Asmal played an important role in the late 1970s in encouraging the ANC to sign its adherence to the Geneva Conventions in 1980, specifically the protocols dealing with irregular warfare. Though this was meant to enable MK militants to be covered by the conventions as prisoners of war, it also meant the ANC had to deal with the enemy that it had captured along the same lines. And friends noted that Asmal's knowledge of the H-Block prison protest in Ireland, with the British government stripping Republican and Loyalist prisoners of special category status from 1976 onwards, introduced an extra layer of consciousness to Kader Asmal over this issue. On one of his visits back to Ireland, Asmal spoke to the Foreign Affairs Committee in Dublin, and I think expecting reminiscences of Dublin in the rare old times. He was instead grilled by his old friends, Senator David Norris and Michael D. Higgins, TD, on South Africa's AIDS policy and Zimbabwe. He shrugged off their talks, their concerns, somewhat bafflingly, as the talk of left-wing loonies. However, Asmal's relationship with the ANC was snapping. He still held the obsequious party line, and he defends them in public, but especially around its deputy president at the time, Jacob Zuma, people could tell he was going through the motions. By the late 2000s, he was disillusioned and starting to challenge the party's orthodoxy. He sensed where things were heading, and when the Scorpions police unit was disbanded, which was one of the state's most effective anti-corruption units, Asmal finally resigned in protest, bringing his political career to a close. He re-entered academia, joining the University of Western Cape as a professor extraordinaire. And by this stage, one of the party's centrists, he also nominated Cyril Ramaphosa via the party's Cape Town branch to be ANC president. And that's the role that leads them to the presidency of South Africa. And it's a further decade before Ramaphosa gets there. But Zuma noticed this and said, "You're trying to undermine me." And so Zuma was sniping at him a lot in public. Following his health deteriorations, Asmal died in June 2011. His posthumous memoir confirmed he'd helped facilitate contracts between the Provisional IRA and the ANC, leading to the Sasolburg oil refinery bombing of 1980, which I discuss in my book. Again, I just don't quite have the time to be able to cover it today. Similarly, the same with the Dunnes Stores protest in the detail it deserves. It's a very big chapter that I look into, and I'm very happy to discuss it if anyone has any questions about it. It's complicated, far more so than is often presented, and it arose originally as industrial action, pitting workers against bosses, labour versus capital, part of the battle between, as the late Nell McCafferty put it, a young man who has just started running a union and an old man who has always run the store by ignoring the union. And the old man is Ben Dunn, owner of Dunnes Stores, and the young man was a man named John Mitchell, new chief executive of the Irish Distributive and Administrative Trade Union, IDATU, which is now a present-day mandate. But I want to mention comments the former President of Ireland, Michael Lee Higgins, who was active in the movement in Galway, made. He recalled visiting the picket in Henry Street in the North Inner City, in Dublin, just off O'Connell Street. And he remembered that one of the strikers held aloft an orange and was able to speak about the conditions under which it was picked in South Africa, making, as he put it, the connection that people weren't willing to make, that first of all, rights are universal, the ability to be able to make a connection between principle and the lives of people very far away, and to be able to become proximate through action and support at a distance. The Dunnes women, mainly women strikers, realized that their own country's rights are enshrined with those of others at a distance. And ultimately, this leads to one of the final elements of the IAAM's going beyond the single issue campaigning, which is how it goes into anti-racist campaigning in Ireland. And they hold numerous anti-racism events in their existence. In one notable example, in 4th of July 1968, they organized a vigil for Martin Luther King, who'd been gunned down a couple of months earlier. Kader and Asmal pushed for years for the Irish government to ratify the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. Article 3 specifically condemned apartheid, and the Irish government signed this in 1968, but they hadn't ratified it locally. And it remained embarrassing, Asmal argued, that this had not been finalised or ratified. So the IAAM worked in conjunction with other anti-racist groups in Ireland on both sides of the border, including the Belfast arm of the Anti-Nazi League. And gentleman who gave me this particular document's in the room here, as usual in Belfast. But the group picketed an Ulster Unionist Party rally in Ballynahinch, Orange Hall, quite bravely during the 1979 general election, for the reason that former Conservative MP Enoch Powell was standing for the UUP for the first time in South Down. He won the seat in that election, but lost it 8 years later to Eddie McGrady. And you can see the references in the document. The acceptable face of fascism. What is a right-wing racialist Englishman doing over here anyway? No love for the Irish people. Don't vote for Enoch Powell, kick him out of Northern Ireland for good. Just to bring this to a close, although the IAM faced resistance to its efforts, they laid the groundwork for anti-racist groups to emerge during the 1980s, including a group called Harmony, which was founded in 1986 to campaign for an act to govern racial discrimination and help Black and mixed race families who received racist abuse. The executive committee members of the IAM were involved with it and staged pickets with Harmony outside the Irish Department of Foreign Affairs in 1988. And there's some anecdotal evidence that Kader and Louise Asmal was cagier about being involved in anti-racist campaigns on behalf of travellers. It's an interesting point because he's cautious and shrewd. But the point remained, Ireland had still not ratified the UN International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination in Domestic Legislation. The lack of race relations legislation in Ireland is still an issue, led to a situation where British racist and far-right groups used Dublin addresses for distribution in Great Britain. So one such group was the National Socialist Irish Workers' Party, with an address in Ringsend, who put up posters in Dublin, distributed their literature in cards to young people in telephone kiosks, bus shelters, and they put them in the sleeves of records by Black artists in music shops and retail outlets. The group also went under the name the National Socialist Party of the UK, and they supply Nazi regalia and literature to right-wingers there. as the anti-Semitic, anti-Black and anti-traveller material contravened British race relations law. The group got around such legislation by using the titles interchangeably. So its Dublin premises, famously outed as 69 Eugene Street, supply the right-wing extremists in the UK and led to Dublin being called by Mervyn Taylor, GD, the clearinghouse for racist literature all over Europe. Asmal commented that working class women married to Black men suffered the most from racial prejudice, but that this was rarely discussed. All parties were responsible, Asmal argued. They have all been in position to do something about it. They are all guilty of inaction, and the church remained silent. And by the time the UN Convention was ratified in 2000, Asmal was a government minister well out of Ireland. So I want to end on this just because in our current world, being involved in anti-racist campaigning is, of course, inherently political and most certainly impacts on local and national politics. It leads to pressure for legislative change. And of course, it leads to a backlash from far-right groups who are increasingly represented at municipal level on Dublin City Council and in the Seanad, even if they lack the charismatic leader to make the breakthrough into the Dáil. So the story of the Irish Anti-Apartheid Movement is located between its ultimate success and the longer battles that remain in Ireland on matters of race. So in the mid-1980s, after it was announced that, mainly thanks to the Dunn Store strike, the government ban on fruit and vegetables would be introduced, the Minister for Foreign Affairs, Peter Barry, confirmed that a new law banning all forms of racial discrimination would be introduced. So a toothless prohibition of incitement to hatred act was passed in 1989, and more recently, a new and controversial bill on hate speech, the Criminal Justice Bill, was passed in the Dáil in October 2024, after the then Minister of Justice, Helen McEntee, removed the provisions on incitement from the criminal justice legislation. The world's wealthiest man, chief executive of X, formerly Twitter, Elon Musk, who grew up in apartheid South Africa and whose family fortune was linked to emerald mining in Zambia, promised to fund legal challenges to the introduction of any hate speech law in Ireland. So I want to end on the feeling that I encountered from many of my interviewees, which alights on the way that those involved in anti-apartheid campaigning never quite felt the same sense of victory in other campaigns. It seemed to them like a victory free from doubt. I think this is memory playing tricks myself. For those who persevered in trade unionism in Ireland and peacemaking in Northern Ireland, the movement imparted the sharper lesson, as one put it, of a sense of solidarity in terms of social injustice and oppression, and the fact that you couldn't be constrained by national borders, or if you did try and turn your back on something that was happening elsewhere, it was giving a political, moral basis that then could come back and bite you at some point. While the solidarity ripples of the Irish Anti-Apartheid Movement puncture its own myth of a non-political Irish movement, its enmeshment with civil rights, anti-racism, and other causes render it a considerable force in Irish public life during the latter part of the 20th century. Historians and scholars should continue to study the pushback it faced, as well as those who supported it. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much for giving us a real sense of the principal themes and arguments in this very important book on the Irish Anti-Apartheid Movement and its continuing significance right the way through to the present. So you're happy to take a few questions. We've got people online. If you're online, just type your question into the chat box or raise your hand digitally. Becca will let us know that you want to ask a question, but start with the room. Anyone like to start? Virgil?
That's great. Really interesting.
Thank
You
you.
touched on religion in a few places. The Methodist organizer, the branch here, maybe there's a religious dimension to the DUP being an outlier in terms of their enthusiasm. I'm wondering how important is religion historically organised churches in thinking about the anti-apartheid movement in Ireland?
Yeah, firstly, thank you, Virgil. Very important. And again, what their attitude and what Kader Asmal's attitude is, and I do think it's worth comparing the way some solidarity movements are functioning in our present, which is to lean towards radicalism. Kader Asmal's view is much more get the establishments on your side, get in with them, use them to further your agenda and your cause. So they're very keen to involve the Catholic Church, for instance, and the previous Pope to John Paul was, who obviously becomes Pope in 1976, was more condemnatory of apartheid. Again, in the context, I think, of the Cold War, the Vatican is much more careful with John Paul and his statements about it, which are that you have to have lines and dialogue with all regimes. So they don't tackle it for this because they don't want to fight with the church. If anything, they want people involved from the church in different ways, and certainly from the Catholic Church. So the guy who I discuss in the book and who's very hugely important is Father Austin Flannery, the Dominican figure, very who I heard from when I interviewed Michael D. Higgins, he'd married Michael D. and Sabina, so he's quite, again, typically in Irish terms. He had also been someone who had that kind of more sometimes more slightly more liberal view on certain matters. Flannery, again, a figure in Irish life who you would see. So he became chairman. He took over from Patrick Lynch. And they keep him involved as long as they possibly can. Another guy was Liam O'Keefe, was involved literally in the executive committee, and they make sure that they try and get also obviously donations from the church as well. And it's very much a case of don't keep those power centers, which are important in Ireland, away from our activity and our orbit. It's actually to involve them. So they're hugely important. The only other person I would mention and it's a Northern link who I need to add is the Reverend Terence Mulcahy. That Mulcahy was obviously another Northern liaison into the movement. He starts appearing from about the 1970s on platforms and then becomes heavily involved in the 1980s, and is the chair as well again, and becomes hugely significant. Again, he's within Trinity. So you're using that kind of bastion of Irish influence, and he's actually much more combative than Kader Asmal, again, with them, because he can be. But Terence Mulcahy also is involved with the Dublin Housing Action Committee and the Civil Rights Movement, and he's someone who brings all of those causes again together. And so the clerical figures are hugely important, both in terms of the face of the movement, and they're not just token priests. They're people who are actively committed.
Maybe following on a little bit from Douglas' question, thanks for my final talk as well. Is program important to this? Because my understanding is they're in the 80s, they're kind of more coming out of what's going on in Latin America. They're highly critical of US policy in Latin America, but I presume they're quite important with what's going on here, from what I understand, and how they seem like, what my limited understanding, it's a very unusual part of the Catholic world where it's very, so I'm presuming it's part of that.
Could I ask one more thing to that? I think it's all the same thing. I was going to ask you the link between the missionary overseas development of Ireland, maybe not institutionally, but certainly individuals who had been there and come back. My memory, Norman Taggart had worked abroad and married abroad, and therefore brought that back with him. And I would think that would be the same in the South. So that kind of individual church links in terms of working with communities in Africa and elsewhere.
Absolutely, you're spot on, Brian. And the educational aspects as well, right? So they say, and it's funny how you still meet people who say, my parents were educated by Irish nuns or priests or whatever, still in South Africa. And I think that's important to identify with Taggart. It's difficult with Trócaire, and I've got to just put the cards on the table about it, in the sense of it's a very impressive organization that does a lot of work around Africa and in developing countries. The way I discuss it is through the Duns Stores dispute, because they had an issue with Casey. Okay, and Bishop Eamon Casey is now let's say, call a spade and say it's discredited because of various associations, to say the least. But at the time, what they resent, those strikers, is that he's very powerful, and there's a good side to him back then as well, which is that, you know, they do things on behalf of Irish immigrants in Britain as well. So Mary Manning, they wrote to him something very innocuous about support, a bit more support for their campaign, or could you appear on a certain panel? He said, you should be writing to me. Don't write to me. Don't write to me.
You shouldn't be doing this. And as impetuous, I think was the word that he used. Okay. And it was a bit of a tricky one because they did do a lot of fundraising and a lot of legwork, but equally they had this interesting thing. It was a great thing in certain ways where they said it's a conscientious decision, right? So we're getting very much into Enoch Burke territory. Okay. So it's your individual conscientious decision, which the churches admire and emphasize. And that can work in your favor. But if your conscientious decision is we should trade with South Africa, then you have that right. Okay. So it's all very well to say that, but it's not going to be enough. The thing that has to happen is the government has to introduce the ban, which Garret FitzGerald's government did quite narrowly. And it fell to his deciding vote because it was the Labour Fine Gael coalition and it was split beyond those lines. So it's a controversial one a bit with Trócaire, and I'm trying to balance the work that they do with the seeing it from the perspective and the more critical perspectives of the Dunstore strikers. Okay.
Look forward to it.
Thank you.
Any questions online? So I'm ask when you mentioned almost kind of anecdotally the Garda outrider, has the conversation with Kader Asmal in the 1990s and kind of confesses to having been part of a surveillance team.
Yeah.
Back in the day. Have you any sense of what degree the Irish state is putting the movement under surveillance? Are there any available sources on that, or is that still all under wraps?
No, it's not under wraps. It was very well known that Special Branch was tapping the Asmal's phones. It was in McGill magazine. And again, it's a bit of a strange one because there's a list, which includes, by the way, a very diverse list, including Ian Paisley and various radical politicians and my grandfather as well, which is interesting to see. And Kader Asmal. They know that McGill publishes it's called Big Brother's Tactics, and it says the names of the people whose phones are being bugged, and that was 1980. So they know quite seriously the level of that. I think it's difficult for me to speculate on some of the other details. The late Neil Farris, who a lot of you would see and known around here, used to live up there. He told me that he thought it was unthinkable that Trinity and the Irish establishments didn't know about his more murkier activities. And in the late 1970s, I mentioned the militants who were engaged. They got in the border area training for MK activists and volunteers, and the Provisional IRAs involved in those. The go-between was Mick O'Riordan of the Irish Communist Party and Gerry Adams. And I'm inclined to agree with Neil. Rest in peace. That that it's unthinkable the Irish state didn't know about this stuff. I think that they do know about it, and that kind of surveillance culture was very widespread through Special Branch. I found it was kind of tricky to sort of just piece together again anecdotally what people were telling me and the stuff which is actually documented. The only thing, other thing I would also stress is that obviously he's kind of safe in Ireland. They thought that apartheid itself would destroy a lot of records on their way out, and Kader Asmal's son, Adam Asmal, I managed to interview him and Louise in Cape Town about 2018, and what they said was that they had seen there was a series of programs which the journalist Max Dupré was fronting, and Max came in one evening, and Adam was working. He was a technician. He was a program maker, and he was working on these programs, and they were very widely viewed. They were the Truth and Reconciliation Commission deliberations and hearings, and he came in and he was clutching a document, and he showed it to Adam Asmal. He said, "Have you seen this?" And he said, "It's the hit list of people in Europe." It would surely have been the sort of thing that would be destroyed by most regimes on their way out, and Kader was number 6, he said, and he said he had it up in his loft, this document. So again, the threats to him were very real. And there's probably a few more things I think to come out about it as well. But generally the Irish surveillance was it's well known with the heavy gang and special branch that there was a lot of that, and unquestionably Kader was under a lot of surveillance. And I think that people involved in the movement, such as Barry Desmond of the Labour Party, who moved away from the movement over the affiliation of Sinn Féin, said they found that problematic because they knew as ministers that this was going on and what was happening. Okay. Yes.
Yeah, well, my name is Connal Parr, and I'm a member of the Anti-Apartheid Movement from age 21, and was also secretary of the Anti-Nazi League in Belfast when I was 21 as well. I'll just make a couple of observations. One is that the picketing at Powell, there was no greater love for the police that night when the police arrived to protect us, because the big burly farmers in South Down who were going to hear Enoch Powell were not amused to see these very liberal, friendly students standing outside their Orange Hall protesting against Enoch Powell. In fact, the police, I think, I don't think they really wanted to, but they had to make sure to protect us. That's a very interesting one. What I was going to comment upon is the fact that the trade union movement learned a lot, though, from the anti-apartheid struggle, and they also learned a lot from the campaign in general against racism. For example, here in Belfast, and again, I was involved in both of them because I was the chair of the Irish Congress Trade Union Youth Committee at the time. We organised a concert in the Mandela Hall on Rock Against Sectarianism, which was modelled on the British campaign Rock Against Racism. And we also launched a major campaign against sectarianism called Hands Off My Mate, which again was modelled on the European TUC campaign, which was throughout Europe, but was all on the basis of racism, Hands Off My Mate. But we modelled it on sectarianism here. So there were very important links with the trade union movement also. I was very proud to propose a motion at the ICTU Annual Congress in 1985, 86, when Mandela was still in prison, and it was to support the campaign, the Free Nelson Mandela, and it was carried unanimously at the ICTU Congress in Dublin, I think it was that particular year. But the trade union movement were very strong supporters of the anti-apartheid struggle.
Can I just also add to that what Tony said there? So I do a lot about the trade unionism as it goes across support for anti-apartheid activities from the 60s to the end of the movement, and it's heavily involved in a way again that's different from the British movement. There's a great quote from a guy called Zola Zemba, who was an ANC activist and came over to for COSATU and came over to the UK and was in Ireland as well. And he said the thing with the British workers was they were good trade unionists. They were they knew how to win concessions, but they would then defend things like the Suez invasion with you when you talk to them, not realizing the solidarity implications. And his phrase was they're industrially very strong, politically weak, which is an interesting way of phrasing it. But the thing with one of the heroes of the book, really not someone who would otherwise be seen as a hero really in many other capacities, is Mickey Mullen of the Irish Transport and General Workers Union. Very stalwart supporter of the boycotts at a time when it's quite rare of a mold person of that mold to be an anti-apartheid supporter. Yes, he's a kind of got the credentials of the IRA internee career back in the day, but he's also someone who has to be, he's a Labour senator and Labour TD. In fact, he was Dublin's only TD at one point in the early 60s. And he is always pushing down the trade union opposition. It's more complicated than people realize. The hotel unions didn't like the demonstrations against the Springboks, and he faces it down. And he says, no, there's going to be, they won't be able to get a hotel in Dublin, which is why they go out to Bray, in Wicklow, for when they arrive in Ireland in January 1970. And then later, people like Agnes McCormack as well. And again, people will remember Agnes would use her time at Congress to make speeches. And there's this great speech that Vic managed to get in, where she talks about how it's our duty to hear Mandela, and we owe it to Mandela to push back against the inequality and the injustice, and to make sure that we don't forget about them. And again, that's leadership. You're going to get a backlash for that. You're going to get people saying, why do you care about people in Africa? Why aren't you focused on the wage disputes that we're dealing with right now? And that's the real solidarity that comes from trade unionists in Ireland and trade union leaders like that.
Well, just say very briefly that the Anti-Nazi League's biggest ever protest rally that they ever had was in the Mandela Hall, and the guest speaker was Irish.
Thank you. Okay.
Sorry. Kader told me in Derry in 1984 that he was really worried about being targeted for attack by South African security. He'd been informed that he was on the list, but told not to repeat it to anyone.
Yeah.
And then there's a question from Patricia Mallon, who says, do I misremember, but when Adrian Belfer of this parish was shot inside in Belfast in the 90s, was a link not established between loyalists and misinformation from South Africa?
Yes. So firstly, thanks to Avila. It's good to know she was there. She was a great interviewee for this. And in response to what Patricia is asking there, so there's a big section on Adrian's shooting. I was saying to Peter earlier, I didn't know if he'd be here, and it'd be a bit weird. It's like he's just there, and you're just going to talk about when he was shot. And it was a very, I sort of pieced it together. Yes. So and it's just there. His house is just Fitzwilliam. She says literally stone's throw from here as well. So I'll briefly explain what happened here. Adrian, there was a file on Adrian, which the South African authorities had prepared since he appeared on stage with no less than Robert Kennedy, who visited the University of Cape Town in the early 60s. And it was a particular educational scheme in Botswana that Adrian was involved in, but he was never really an anti-apartheid activist. And it was strange because he'd been in South Africa, and in the mid-80s, he'd actually visited South Africa. And if they wanted to get him then, that would be the time to do it. And I traced it to, there was a conference where he clashed with a member of Inkatha Freedom Party, which was the Zulu Nationalist Party. And they used to have what Adrian called spooky whites, who were these white guys who were around, who were pro-apartheid people, who were backing Inkatha financially. And he exposed something about, he said it was to do with the weighted settlement. And he exposed something, and he wasn't trying to, but this guy came off badly. And he thinks that this guy was the person who passed the information that leads to the file being swapped with a different individual, if you're following my threads here, at the University of Ulster, who was genuinely involved in provisional IRA activities. And this file had got into the hands of a couple of agents, Flores and Durant were the names, and they literally showed the UDA his home and said, this is the guy who's this pro-IRA guy and anti-apartheid guy. They showed him in the house. And again, Adrian thought this was really weird because he met with the UDA and he had good relations with Andy Thierry and John McMichael, and he was interested in their ideas, and they were in quite a good phase, if the UDA is ever in a good phase that time. And it was a really weird moment. And so what happened was they go into his house, and the UDA guys, and they shot him and his wife, who appeared, and the gun jammed, and it saved his life. And then he wrote a piece in The Guardian about it, again, very nonchalantly, like a very Adrian way. This happened, and this is the political consequences of this. But it was it's an interesting overlap, and it shows you that they were playing the information, playing with this information. There were various threads and connotations that existed between Ulster loyalism and the apartheid state. I do also go into the arms shipments. They're a little bit heavy going. But I do cover that as well. And there were it was a very large shipment of arms that came in from South Africa, as well as the activities of the notorious double agent Ryan Nelson as well. So they're also worth looking into, but a bit murky. Yes.
Is there any comparative work on the UK anti-apartheid movement? Because I was involved in it in the 70s, and their view of Ireland was it's in good hands. You know, Kader's got it covered, and they did their work, but they were also much more international. And secondly, what was the political dynamics of the overlap with other people's struggles? Because that got lots of people into difficulty. For example, on Chile solidarity around the same time, and then on the freedom struggles in the frontline states, the Portuguese ex-colonies, and so on. And is there any work done on the impact of that, the difficulties of it? And I liked your sort of tracing the lessons thereafter.
Thanks, Quentin. So the British anti-apartheid movement, it's a similar, because in some ways it's a similar body. The first Irish again, it's another reason why you have to realize that the first successful anti-apartheid movements in Europe are in countries outside of the European Economic Community, the UK, Ireland, and Scandinavian countries. So it's all outside of the original member states that make that up. And that's interesting sort of reason why that they become the more successful ones. I do a bit of comparative work, but I found none, and there should be, okay? They're both led by Indian South Africans. Abdul Minty is the British anti-apartheid movement's guy. Again, very impressive, gets close to people, has meetings with Thatcher, same way that Kader would have meetings with Tishi, okay? It's the other thing which is really similar, I think quite amusingly to me in hindsight, probably not amusingly at the time, is how centralized they are. So they're so intolerant of dissenting. If you're too left-wing, especially Trotsky, he seems to have a particular penchant against Trotskyites, Kader. It really has a thing about, honestly. But it's very clear that they're trying to get into establishments, to get close to establishments, not be tainted by association, not be tainted by radicalism. There is an issue which is different, which is to do with what in the UK, what's really important is that a lot of people in the movement felt in the British anti-apartheid movement, why are there not more West Indians and people of colour in the movement? This should be reflected in our population. It should be reflected in, you know, the impact of the Windrush generation. Ireland doesn't have a Windrush generation. It doesn't have the same level. So it's not, people aren't saying in Ireland, where are the people of colour in our leadership? Why can't we be more involved in those? Why can't we be more involved in those organisations? There was a great thing that Stuart Hall said, which was that the British anti-apartheid movement is really about something else. It's about finding a post-war progressive role for the left. And actually apartheid is important, but not as important as that journey for those people. And I do think it's interesting, worth seeing it along those lines for Ireland, which is what's the effect of people afterwards and what they do after it. That's why I had that quote at the end from Avila, where she talks about the lessons you learn from that campaign. You know, and it's that campaigns can be grind and that they can be hard. Someone has to write the letters, someone has to loop people in, someone has to face the dismissive attitudes on the picket line if you're on the Dunnes Stores strike. So it's very, very important. So the second question you had was in terms of how the solidarity movements, I think it's very interesting how bound up they always are. And it's something which again unites the British and Irish movements with each other. And I think it relates partly to that Stuart Hall comment that it's often about trying to find a different kind of role for your activism, as well as, and again, there's this culture of, and I did meet people who said, you know, there was this culture of what protest is it today? It's something about, so we're going, and they turn up on things, and people used to come along and they would say, and it was, you know, it's very interesting how they don't even know sometimes what protest they're on. It's a group of people. It's a social thing. And I think that those dynamics are also really important. A guy called Matt Graham does, who's Dundee University, does a very interesting work on how it's the difference between this. He's taking the centralized movement and looking at the way the British anti-apartheid movement is actually quite strong in its different cities and regions, and it's completely separate from Minty and London. So it's kind of interesting to see. I think that we probably something like that is occurring, that we can do that as a case study in Ireland as well.
Yes, I was in the Scottish Anti-Apartheid Movement, and we're a year or two on the national committee, and we were ignored in Scotland by the centre, and sometimes slapped down for doing stuff that they didn't like, and then credit taken when we picked the Mandela name, street name, and we didn't Glasgow and so on.
Yes, exactly. The final thing I'll say is that there is a very strange thing as well, that the City of London group, which was the more radical group, who wanted sort of street-based tactics, did try and take over the British anti-apartheid movement leadership. And it was, again, this left-wing militants, as they're considered to be, often around the GLC and often involved in left-wing politics. The sort of the lunatics are taking over the asylum and they're going to destroy us, sort of thing, the movement feels. And it happens at exactly the same time as the controversy around the Irish anti-apartheid movements and the affiliation of Sinn Féin, which actually occurred in 1981 but blew up in 1984 and led to the resignation of Gareth Fitzgerald. And Kader Asmal says there's too many. It's really weird how this is occurring at the same time, and there's almost, it can't be a coincidence. It's trying to undermine us, and actually it was completely separate things.
Yes. Okay. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming and participating. It's been a really interesting afternoon. Thank you to Connal for sharing with us the overview of what is, clearly an extremely important and timely book. So it's called Solidarity and Pressure, the story of the Irish Anti-Apartheid Movement. And if you can't afford to buy a copy, then do recommend one to your local library. And hopefully it'll be paperbacked by Oxford before too long. But can we finish by thanking Connal for coming to speak to it? And just before people go, so we've got a seminar next month at the same time. We've got Ciara McAllister, who was until quite recently here in Queen's, now at the University of Galway, and she will be speaking on